Have you driven a Ford? When was the...
No little cinnamon gum freshens breath longer than Big Red.
VH1 presents the history of video music. In the beginning, there was radio. Great sound, terrible picture. Then came television. Great picture, hold your ears. Next, there was MTV. For some people, it looked and sounded great. Now, there's VH1, the one in digital Dolby stereo sound. The right sound for the right one.
VH1.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to 40 years ago this month. Because now we're talking about the 80s. So if you didn't know, for several years, I did a series of episodes called 30 years ago this month that highlighted shit from a few years in the early 90s. But once we got to 2025, that sounds like the future. And we were talking about 1995. I'm like, I don't have as much that I'm excited about that I really want to talk about. But on the other hand, 1985, when I was 7 years old, there's a whole lot that I want to talk about. So lo and behold, the show morphs into 40 years ago this month. And we're going to be talking about all kinds of cool shit from 1985. So as you saw there in the beginning of the episode, the big thing news-wise for me in January of 1985 was the premiere of VH1, premiered on January 1st, 1985. And at the time, I had pretty much just started watching regular MTV, like the year before, probably. And I wasn't interested in watching this new channel that was apparently supposed to be catered to old people and play softer stuff. I don't want to listen to softer stuff. I was discovering Van Halen and shit like that. And I was getting heavier, not softer. The funny thing is that now, looking back on it, as a man who is very soon going to be 47 years old, I'm pretty sure that when they were having the discussion about putting together VH1, they were like, we need softer music for old people. Cool. Like, what kind of age are you going for? What kind of old people? And they're probably like, I don't know, 30? So, yeah. But enough about old people soft music. Let's move over to the regular MTV side of things and let's talk about some 1980s music. So we're going to be talking about the number one songs in the country for each month of 1985. And for the first month, for January of 1985, only one song dominated the charts for the entire month of January 1985. And it was this one right here, Like a Virgin from Madonna. For a lot of us, this was the big introduction to Madonna, and for some people like me, it was the beginning of our lifelong fandom of Madonna. But it's an absolute classic. Everybody knows this song, and it was the number one song in the country for the entire month of January 1985. Okay, of course, we're also going to be talking about the number one albums in the country for each month. And for the first 2 weeks of January 1985, the number one album in the country was Purple Rain by Prince and The Revolution, the soundtrack to the movie of the same name. Although, this album is, so fucking good. And the movie, I enjoy the movie a lot. I know a lot of people think it's kind of shitty or whatever. But at this point, it's almost like, yeah, this is a Prince album. And that movie is the movie to this album. Because it's pretty much fucking perfect. I mean, come on. Yeah, literally every fucking track on this is a banger. And if you haven't heard it before, come on, it's been fucking 40 years. But yeah, first 2 weeks of January 1985, number one album in the country, Prince, Purple Rain. And for the second 2 weeks of January 1985, the number one album in the country was Born in the USA from Bruce Springsteen. Funny enough, I do not currently have this album on vinyl, but 40 years ago, I did, in my small little vinyl collection that I started around that time. And then, like a lot of people, once we got into the 90s, I sold all that shit, unfortunately. But hey, I'm more than made up for it now. But I remember really liking this album, and I haven't heard it in a long time. I mean, obviously I've heard the singles, but as a full album, I haven't heard it in a long time. But I remember it being really good. At this point, it's a fucking classic. One day I'll check it out again because, I like some Bruce Springsteen. Anyway, the last half of January 1985, the number one album, Born in the USA. All right, now let's move on to the movies of 1985. So we're going to be talking about the number one movies in the country for each month, and then any other movies that may come up that I might want to talk about. But in this particular case, the movie that was number one for the entire month of January 1985 is also one of my favorite movies of the 80s, and that is Beverly Hills Cop. Now, I did not see this movie in the theater, but I do remember that it was one of the first VHSs that my mom bought soon after we got our first VCR, and I watched it a bunch, and I loved it then, and I still love it now. Every time I watch this movie, for me, it's held up remarkably well. It's, yeah, sure, in certain respects, it still feels very 80s, but overall, God, it's just a really fun, well-done movie, and Eddie Murphy fucking rules. I love Eddie Murphy. I love this movie. And apparently so did a whole bunch of fucking people in America because it was number one all month. Oh, and by the way, I brought the soundtrack just because this wasn't the number one album in the country, but it fucking should have been. It's got fucking two bangers from Patti LaBelle, New Attitude and Stir It Up. Not to mention Neutron Dance by the Pointer Sisters, The Heat Is On by Glenn Frey, and of course, Axel F. That's a banger right there, folks. Honestly, I want there to be more music in movies like Axel F. I think, did Fletch come out in 1985 also? Because the Fletch theme is done by the same guy. And if that's the case, we will also be talking about Fletch. That's for damn sure. But not right now. So yeah, the number one album in the country. No, the number one movie in the country. But a soundtrack that's number one in my heart. Beverly Hills Cop. All right, now let's talk about the album releases of January 1985, or should I say the EP release of January 1985, because the only thing I really wanted to talk about that came out on January 28th, 1985, and that is this guy right here, David Lee Roth, Crazy from the Heat. And this was the first brand new Van Halen related thing that came out after I really got into Van Halen. I was really into 1984. It was the first big rock album for me. It kicked open a lot of doors. But when this came out, I just thought it was so much fun. I still think it's so much fun. This was in my top 10 EPs of all time when we did the Cranked and Ranked thing like a month back. Also, this album cover. I love this album cover. It's very pleasing to the eye. And I'm not just talking about shirtless Diamond Dave there. But yeah, 4 cover songs, extremely well done, a whole bunch of fun. What more could you want out of the first EP from David Lee Roth? So yeah, released January 28th, 1985, David Lee Roth, Crazy from the Heat. All right, so that is it for January of 1985. But who wants to jump forward 10 years but also still be in the past? Okay, so here we are, January 1995. So there's really only one release I wanted to talk about from January 1995. And guess what? It's also Van Halen related. It's fucking Van Halen Balance. This came out on January 24th, 1995, and was the last Van Halen album with Mr. Sammy Hagar on vocals, which I love. I love every Van Halen album. At this point, when this came out, I did not like it, and I thought it was pretty fucking lame, but it has aged really well with me. If you were like me and you haven't given this album another chance yet, I would say it's worth it. And just keep in mind that it's Van Halen in 1995. So compared to other sort of like aging rock bands that did shit in the mid-90s, this is honestly one of the best ones. At this point, I love this album because I feel like there were not enough Van Halen albums. Just because, as I've said many times on other things here, I just love hearing Eddie Van Halen, Alex Van Halen, and Michael Anthony playing together. And all the singers they've had, I also love them too. But those dudes, I just love hearing them play. And that's all there is to it. So if you're like me, then you probably also really enjoy Balance, the only album I want to talk about from January of 1995. All right, so that's it for the very first episode of 40 years ago this month. So this entire year, we're going to be talking about all sorts of cool music and movies from 1985, and then at the end, a little bit of 1995 stuff. So happy 2025, everyone. We're going to have a really fun year. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all again next month.